All right, so for the Western Heritage, Chapter 8, we're going to be talking, we've talked about the Crusades and kind of the big ideas of defining what the Middle Ages are, but now we're going to look at some of the people and the classes that made up the kind of Middle Age Europe. So with medieval society, we'll talk about the social hierarchies, we'll talk about the development of towns and urbanization, a little bit about the increase and changes in the education world with the founding of universities. So the three primary classes that we tend to think about, right, the nobles or the upper classes, then the clergy, those who serve the church, and then of course the peasants. And we'll briefly chat about some of the details that make each of those unique. And then the emerging class, which is coming about and really developing in the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries, is the merchant class. We're going to talk about its impact on medieval society moving forward, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of those schools and universities. So there's a lot we could say about the nobles, right, about who made them up, but really being in the noble class was all about having the right last name. If you're from the right family, you own land, right, and maybe owned a little feudal village or feudal town or feudal community. And if you didn't have the right last name, you were a peasant, and you were probably stuck for life. So not a lot of movement up and down. A lot about entertainment, right? They'd have tournaments and hunt and spend money and wage wars and get involved in politics, but not a lot of actual mobility. The clergy, your textbook says, again, a lot we could talk about, different types, regular clergy, secular clergy, what their roles were. But for our purposes, the church offered, according to our textbook, the gifted commoners their best chance at social mobility. So as you'll read in your novel, right, in the Shadow of the Cathedral, you'll realize that right, it wasn't that the peasants, Martin and Andrew, could just decide, I want to be a noble, but they could make a decision to potentially join the church. And the church, right, especially in the 11th and 12th centuries, is fairly wealthy, and so there's some opportunity for social mobility through the church. And then there's the peasants, right? And this is by far the vast majority, right? 98% or more of the population, right? The life of a serf or one of the peasants, their goal is to meet the quotas for the local nobles and clergy. So they would work and they would serve, whether they were, right, a farmer, a blacksmith, a tanner, whatever their job may be. And their main focus was survival, as you read in History of the Eyes of Faith last week. They didn't have a whole lot of time for other, entertainment or other things. They were really about trying to survive through to the next winter. Some changes were taking place, though, as we get into the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries. So you had some technological advances, right? The horse collar was invented, the horseshoe, three-field system, rotating your crops around. And what that allowed, right, was an opportunity for increased wealth. So if you were a tenant farmer and you could make enough food for the local noble, the local lords, and then had also some additional food or some additional land, they could sometimes lease it out to their peasants who could, if they wanted to, work a little harder and make a little bit extra money on the side, and this in turn would help to kind of grow and establish what became the merchant class. So what are your options, though, if you don't want to be a peasant anymore? Is it easy to, if you've seen the movie A Knight's Tale, change your stars? Again, you can maybe join the clergy, but you couldn't just decide, hey, I want to get wealthy and become a noble. And that begs an interesting question, right? How do they, that is the nobles, become noble? In the movie A Knight's Tale, he asked that question. He said, how do they become noble in the first place? He says they took it at the point of a lance, right, or a point of a sword, that they decided we're the most powerful, we're the right family, and they became nobles. Right, and there's been a lot of debate historically about the divine right of kings. Well, how do we know that God has chosen kings and chosen nobles and chosen rulers? Just a couple brief thoughts on this, because it's really an interesting question that I'm going to ask you a little bit more about in your other coursework this week. But Romans 13, again, we're called to submit to authorities that are over us as God putting them in power. So if someone becomes a king or governor or president or whatever it may be, we can trust that the Lord had a hand in that, that he allowed it. In fact, it's interesting, though, Psalm 2 has a picture of the kings of the earth raising their fists at God, as if somehow, right, that if you get all these evil people and powerful, that somehow God would be in threat. And it says God looks down and laughs at them. He says, you gotta be kidding. He says, I put you in those positions, and so don't abuse them. Daniel 2:21, we referred to this earlier in the course, but just that, right, authority does ultimately come from God. He appoints kings, and he takes them down. So again, if we wrestle with this, and people have wrestled this for a long time, how do nobles become noble? Well, they might take it by force, but as Christians, right, through our lens of faith, we can trust that God's got a hand in the matter, and we don't need to worry, even if they're abusive and oppressive. So the merchant class, I alluded to them just a minute ago, right? Who made up the merchant class? Well, it was disenchanted, sometimes runaway, and occasionally wealthy peasants, right? Those who maybe worked a little extra land, made some extra money, or maybe come up with a trade or something that they could make or create and sell. And a lot of times it was foreigners. It would be someone maybe from the Middle East or from Northern Africa or somewhere else who had a different product available, and they were willing to travel, and they would make their living in trade. Right, and for some of the poor, right, this hope of improvement, this idea that if I work hard, maybe I can just make a little extra on the side and maybe afford a little fun, a little entertainment, a little, a nicer house, perhaps, actually would kind of motivate them and keep them going. Your book kind of calls these the ambitious entrepreneurs, or these are like middle-aged capitalists. So this emerging trade group comes about, especially in the later centuries in the Middle Ages. So again, the landscape is changing. So after the collapse of the Roman Empire, a lot of people moved away from the main cities and kind of scattered into these little feudal kingdoms all across the former Roman Empire. But as you get kind of towards the late Middle Ages, you're going to see a movement back towards the cities, right? In the 11th to 12th centuries, there weren't a lot of large cities. By the 13th century, some of this changes as some nobles are starting to unite some land, starting to become more powerful. Some of that is directly connected to the Crusades. And they're starting to recognize that if they allow a growing merchant class, if their cities are growing and thriving, it's to their benefit. If you're a noble and you're over a powerful town that grows into a small city and then a larger city, it's better for your wealth, better for your protection. You're more likely to be safe from foreign invaders. And it's really an opportunity to kind of establish your strength. So in the 13th century, you get growth in cities. And again, it's kind of like the reverse effect. So when the Roman Empire collapses, it disintegrates into these little feudal kingdoms. Well, when the cities start to grow and people move back towards the cities, you're going to kind of get the end of those little feudal kingdoms as you're going to get some larger kingdoms and eventually some larger nations that are going to develop, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. Right, and it's interesting, right? In the midst of all this, as feudal society is disintegrating, the upper classes, the nobles, are starting to wonder about these merchants who are constantly gaining wealth, and it's not like they can work their way up and become noble, but they certainly are living like nobles. And so there were laws passed all over Europe called sumptuary laws and sartorial laws. And these are sumptuary comes from the idea of consumption, which they actually made rules on how much money people could spend, on what people could spend things on. So if you were a merchant and you were very wealthy, you couldn't necessarily go out and buy certain clothes, because if you looked too much like a noble, people might confuse you for a noble, and that would be unacceptable. And they made rules, right? If you're a peasant or of the lower classes, just because you can afford it doesn't mean that you're allowed to eat the food, for example, of the wealthy and the food of the nobles. So anyway, just a sense of change is slow and not everybody is a big fan. Right, schools and universities are starting to develop also in this period. So there's kind of a rebirth in the education in high Middle Ages, and one of the reasons is that there's a revival of interest in the classics, not just because in the church there's an interest in growth and reading, but as the Middle East and the Westerners kind of clashed in the Crusades, there was actually some Islamic scribes who had been saving and preserving some old Roman classics. And it's interesting, there was those in the West who actually found kind of a treasure trove of their own ancient writings of the Greeks and the Romans amongst the Islamic scribes. So there's this increased interest in religion, right? And the church is always powerful, and it's always becoming more powerful. And these new schools that are developing to train people required recognition. So what they would form were these little scholars guilds where you had to get your certificate to prove that you were a teacher who can move around from college to college or school to school, and that you're actually certified to train. So you had to get what they called a teaching certificate. And they actually, right, these teacher's licenses were kind of the idea, or the predecessors to our modern academic degrees. So the fact that we graduate with degrees that say I'm now certified and I'm qualified to do such and such, that came back from this period in the Middle Ages. Right, an example, the University of Bologna, one of the first, and kind of sets an example for later universities that are developed. Now, it's not that there weren't schools before, right? In fact, if you want to compare, there were cathedral schools, like you read about in The Shadow of the Cathedral, where if you were either wanted to send your kid off to serve and work with the church, think of what Samuel's mother Hannah did for him, right? Dedicating him to the temple for life. That was an option. And then there were just even some of the middle class, the noble classes who would get education at the schools. And the main focus, though, was focus on clerical preparation, so getting them ready to actually serve in the church. But eventually they're going to start to change, and they're going to offer some training for secular vocations, right? So you're going to learn to read and write, but you're also going to learn a specific trade in the cathedral schools. Whereas the universities like the University of Paris, for example, are going to focus much more on philosophy and rhetoric and government. Right, the University of Paris was founded by Philip II Augustus. Remember, he's the one who went on the King's Crusade, the Third Crusade. And then Pope Innocent III, right, that powerful but not so innocent, rather corrupt Pope. They found the University of Paris together. And it's some of these large universities where they start developing, right, what they call colleges or dorms and permanent locations. Up to this point, teachers would kind of travel from town to town, city to city, but people started saying, well, it's less efficient to do that. Why don't we build these big buildings and these dorms in these schools where people can come and get an education and then head home or into whatever craft they desire. Right, and at these universities, they'd study law, study trades, and rhetorical skills. Right, University of Paris, here's just a picture, right, still in existence today, one of the main buildings. So what did they teach at these early schools, right? Elementary geometry, right, which is, valuable. Rhetoric, and again, this is the art of persuasion, the art of argument, of forming words and forming statements and forming perspectives, which is beneficial to Christians. And then you would study the classics as well. The classics would include, right, the writings of St. Augustine, the writings of the ancient Greek philosophers, the writings of the scriptures, right? You read the Bible. And this movement called scholasticism, which was referred to in our last unit with History of the Eyes of Faith, Chapter 5. But scholasticism is a method of study associated with the medieval university. And this is really important as we're trying to understand how people thought, what their worldview was. Your textbook, right, Kagan says that in the High Middle Ages, scholars assumed truth was not something one had to discover for oneself. Truth was already enshrined in the works of the great authorities of the past. So in other words, they didn't have to come up with new truth and new ideas. They assumed that there was actual absolute truth. They assumed that people in the past had already discovered and understood those truths. So all we had to do was read the classics, read the works of the past, and try to harmonize them and fit them together. But again, understanding that there was absolute truth in contrast to, right, the present day. A little more on curriculum, right? Books, again, think about this, would be very, very expensive, right? And not easy to publish, not easy to print. So you didn't have a lot of books, and another reason why people would go to universities to study, because you couldn't, take an online course and just order your books easily. But the goal of an education, according to your textbook, was to equip a scholar with the rhetorical skills needed to construct subtle logical arguments and win debates. It's interesting. It doesn't sound so different than Acts 17, does it, right? Get an education so that you can learn to debate and to argue and to defend and produce laws, etc. Right? Now, what was written and what people often studied, so people could be on the same page, were called summas. And the most famous summa was Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, right, the summary of all theology. And this is where he would kind of talk about all the different theologies, passages, ideas that are out there, and try to kind of come up with a final or full description or explanation of what those things actually were meant. So the critics of scholasticism sounds like a good movement, but there were those, right, who felt that it was really abstract, right? Why go off to college, and maybe you can counter this as well, just to get an education to learn to argue? Why don't you just go out and learn to make horseshoes, or learn to make shoes, or learn to farm? Right? It's not really that beneficial. Some felt that it was damaging the Christian faith, right? That it was too philosophical, it was too Aristotelian, that it was connected to, you want to be smarter, and we read in Corinthians, knowledge puffs up, love builds up. And so maybe if we're encouraging people and encouraging people in the church just to be educated, we're maybe turning out snobs who aren't walking with the Lord, right? Your textbook summarizes it this way. It says that there were those who feared that the love of learning clearly conflicted with the love of God at universities. And I would encourage you, as you are, studying in Emmaus or other places, and you study in the future, this is, I think, an important warning for us to keep in mind, that we can become really book smart, but not actually come to know the Lord better. Like, we can know a lot about Jesus, but not actually know Him, not just as Savior, but as friend, and as the Son of God who loved us and gave Himself for us. So, something to keep in mind. Again, we've just kind of wrapped up the chapter. So we talked about the nobles, the clergy, the peasants, the merchants. We talked about the growth of cities and some educational reforms. Hope this was helpful in kind of understanding, some of the things that make each of these classes distinct, and you can understand kind of the flow of the chapter and the flow of the Middle Ages.